Uh, uh, Chew! Oh, excuse me. So, today I'm going to be following up on my last video about the greenhouse effect and how the Earth absorbs the sunlight that comes in as visible light and radiates it off into the atmosphere, and in the atmosphere the greenhouse gases absorb this infrared light and then radiate it either into space or back down at the Earth's surface to be absorbed again. What makes a greenhouse gas? Why do they have such a big impact? Especially if the majority of our atmosphere is composed of nitrogen and oxygen, about 78% nitrogen and 20% oxygen. That only leaves 2% left over. So what do greenhouse gases do? They absorb the heat radiated off of Earth's surface and then radiate back out themselves. And this radiation will either go back into the Earth's surface, out into the atmosphere, into other greenhouse gas molecules, or out into space. So how do these molecules absorb heat? First, let's start with how they move. Asymmetric stretch, a bending vibration, and a symmetric stretch. And each one of these different atoms in the molecules have either a positive or a negative charge. And when these molecules move with either an asymmetric stretch or a bending movement, it creates a dipole. And this is a charge difference, and this charge difference creates resistance with the electromagnetic waves that are light and infrared radiation. And the reason why nitrogen and oxygen won't absorb heat like the greenhouse gases is because they're always going to have a symmetric stretch. So there's never going to be any difference between the charges. So what are some different greenhouse gases? We have water vapor, which is produced from many things, like one of them is when plants photosynthesize. And then we have methane, which is produced in anaerobic conditions that are created in things such as wetlands or animals' digestive systems. And then there's also ozone, which we can find in the stratosphere, but is not so nice when we find in the troposphere. And then there's CO2, the most talked about one, which can be produced in many different ways, from just us breathing and respirating to fossil fuel combustion. Now, each one of these gases has different varying magnitudes when it comes to trapping heat into our atmosphere. And there's a couple of different things to take into consideration. One is how many atoms the molecule has to move. Like methane has 4 different hydrogen atoms surrounding a carbon, which grants it a lot of freedom to move around. And then CO2 can only have the bending and the asymmetric stretch to absorb heat. And another thing to consider is at what quantity they're found in the atmosphere. If there's more of one of these, then that one's going to have a much greater effect. The other thing that affects the magnitude of heat these molecules can absorb is how long its lifetime is within the atmosphere. If it's gone really quick, like that, it doesn't have much time to stick around and do anything. But if it hangs out for a while, we're going to see a greater impact from it. Can you guess which one has the greatest magnitude? Water vapor. So, if water vapor has one of the greatest effects, then what's all this talk about CO2? Why shouldn't we be more concerned with reducing water vapor? Giant oceans that are constantly interacting with the air. We have plants that are photosynthesizing and producing water. Water vapor has a very short lifetime in the atmosphere. CO2 can have a lifetime in the atmosphere of about 100 years, and it's going to hang out there until it can react out. So some ways that it comes out of the atmosphere is rain and weathering, sequestering into the ocean, and photosynthesis. Why does water vapor have this short lifetime? It falls out of the atmosphere in rain and snow. Sometimes we get to see fog. It's pretty neat. So how do we know when it's time to rain? Well, it's when the air gets saturated with water. What does that mean? Saturation is when the atmosphere just cannot hold any more water, and any further evaporation is going to lead to precipitation such as rain or snow. Now, the saturation point can change. If we have a higher temperature, our atmosphere can hold more water, and if we have a lower temperature, our atmosphere will hold less water. And it isn't quite as simple as this. As we have higher and higher temperatures, the saturation point will get harder to reach. And there is a point where the saturation point won't be reached, and the water will not convert into liquid, and it will stay in the atmosphere as gas. But we don't have to worry about this on Earth because we're not operating at that high of a temperature. So this process of the atmosphere being saturated and then the water falling out is called a negative feedback. What is a negative feedback? Well, it's when you have an input, like temperature, and a system that's going to stabilize it. For instance, a thermostat. Thermostats work by being set to a certain temperature, say 72 degrees, 69 degrees, and whenever the room gets too hot, it will kick on the AC and cool the room off, and when the room gets too cold, it'll turn on your heater and warm you back up again. So going back to the water cycle, you have your water vapor as your input, and your clouds and rain as your stabilizer. When there's too much water put in, it falls out of the sky, and it has to happen all over again. So going back to the question, why does CO2 matter? The more CO2 there is, the greater the temperature will be. The greater the temperature is, the more water vapor in the atmosphere. The more water vapor in the atmosphere, the more greenhouse gases there are acting. The more greenhouse gases there are acting, the warmer it's going to be. This is why we care about CO2, because we can have some control over it, because we can make that choice between using a fossil fuel and a renewable energy or some other method. Thanks for watching my video, and I hope you check back later or subscribe if you'd like to hear more from me. Let me know if you have any questions in the comment section below. I'll try to answer them. And also, let me know if you have any things that you'd like to hear discussed in future videos. Planning on talking about these things right here. Don't use them.